guess I'd like to be remembered as someone who helped change the face of bass guitar, and being probably the only bass guitarist that hasn't been copyable.
Entwistle, of course, is, I guess, a big influence on almost anybody and everybody who's picked up an instrument since the 60s.
Oh yeah, John, I knew John well. I could never understand a word he was saying, by the way, but it's like, but he was a funny guy.
He changed the way people look at an instrument, which may seem trivial to some, but it's an instrument and a band in a form of music that basically changed the world.
At the birth of the British invasion, there was a country coming up from the rubble of 2 world wars. There was a band challenging Cold War conformity, and there was a man reshaping the very core of rock and roll rhythm. This is his story, An Ox's Tale. John Alec Entwistle was born in Chiswick, England, October 9th, 1944. As the country was trying to rebuild itself from post-war devastation, bare necessities were a priority. But even amidst the war-torn landscape of working-class London, John's creativity found ample playing ground.
It was great. After the war, there was like bombed-out buildings that had loads of bricks, so we didn't need Lego. We had the real thing, right? So we built little castles. It was a lot of fun back then, yes, because we had like sort of toys everywhere. There'd be like an old warehouse on the other side of the railway track that was full of German helmets, so we'd like sort of sneak in there, break a window, get a helmet, and we'd play Nazis and stuff. They were our toys. We accepted them as we could play with that stuff.
Good stuff, you know, watches and coins and all kinds of weird things. You know, sad things sometimes. You know, you'd be going through the rubble and you'd find a teddy bear. And I was born into that world, and so was John.
Housing was so short in those days that we all lived with my mother. John as well.
His situation at home, he was very open house, and so was Queenie and his stepfather. You know, they welcomed me into the home. I think he had problems with the fact that he couldn't see enough of his real dad, and he blamed Gordon for that a bit. So when I was young, I used to have to side with him against Gordon, you know, miserable old Gordon and nasty old Gordon. You know, I grew up and Gordon was a very, very nice fellow.
Growing up an only child, John was always the centre of attention and jumped at the chance to perform for any and every audience.
I knew he was going to sing when he was 3 years old. He used to be very fond of Al Jolson. He used to know all his numbers.
All the Al Jolson movements, like getting down on my knees and going, "Mummy."
I took him to the cinema to see Al Jolson once, and as soon as Al Jolson started singing, he got up on his seat and started singing the same song. I kept shushing him, but he wouldn't stop, and a voice from the background said, "Let him sing, missus, he's better than Al Jolson anyway."
My first real I guess, performance in public was, there was a local band leader that lived a couple of doors away, played the drums, a guy called Teddy Fulliger, and I was allowed to join his band every Saturday night and play second trumpet, and I was about 12 years old.
Yeah, Teddy Fulliger used to be my neighbour, and I'd grown up with him from school, and he was a drummer. Well, he thought he was. And he decided that he'd form an orchestra, and he asked John if he'd go and play with him. He had to have a dress suit, and of course he didn't have a dress suit, so Teddy's father had one, but it was full of moth holes. My mother sewed all the holes up, shortened the sleeves and shortened the legs, and he wore that to his first gig.
It was in Shepherd's Bush, London, that John and Pete Townsend first crossed paths.
Well, I met John at Acton County Grammar School. He was a big guy, funny, very sharply dressed. We started to talk about music. That was really in the first year. In those days, we didn't have guitars. He just had a trumpet, you know, and a Boys Brigade outfit. You know, he was very keen on the Boys Brigade. We were all interested in traditional jazz at the time, a bit of rock and roll, which hadn't really fully blossomed by that time, basically because there was no radio platform for it in the UK. And the trad jazz that we played was fairly pure. It was based on Louis Armstrong. So it was Willie the Weeper, Saints Go Marching In, people like Kenny Ball and Ken Collier, Chris Barber Band, that kind of stuff. It was very authentic. That bit of our indoctrination, John and I, is very important to when you study the Who's sound. You hear some very weird shit in the Who's sound, and some of it's got to do with the fact that, you know, we used to play a lot of trad jazz.
The young teens took their skiffle to the streets and made a pretty penny busking around the bars of London.
We used to take my father-in-law out every Saturday, and we used to go to a pub in Hammersmith. We always started off there, and we were standing there drinking one night, and we heard this band in the background, somebody on a banjo and somebody else on a trumpet. And when I looked round, it was Pete on the banjo and John on the trumpet. They went around with a hat, they collected quite a bit of money. And I said, "What are you doing out here? You're not old enough to be in the pub anyway." He said, "Oh, this is our last call, we've been out all night." So we've been pub crawling all around the district.
I was astonished at how much money we made. Astonished.
Infused by the lively sounds of jazz and rhythm and blues, John not only developed a passion for improvisation, but he also discovered and ultimately transformed the bass guitar.
He made his own first bass with his own hands, you know. Great over-length bass with very, very long strings.
We bought the wood for it, carved it out, made the neck, and got somebody to do all the fretwork on the neck for him. I was amazed when he played it. I never thought it would play. Amazing. And he painted it mauve.
His passion at the time was that he wanted to be a lead guitarist, but decided to defer. You know, he knew I could play really good guitar. So he picked up the bass and started to tinker about with the bass. And you very quickly got the feeling that, okay, he's playing the bass, but he's not really playing the bass. You know, this is something else. And what he realised was that he had the power to change the fucking instrument.
When I moved on to bass, it was a whole different ballgame. You know, I was teaching myself how to play, and there wasn't really that many people to copy.
John's bass style, who knows? You know, it was very, very, very complex. It may have been inspired by, you know, all that stuff. You know, it's the same movement, isn't it? Exactly the same.
It was in 1962 that Roger Daltrey entered the scene, recruiting Townsend and Entwistle into his hard-edged rock and roll band, the Detours. Soon joined by rambunctious drummer Keith Moon, a musical explosion was in the making. Attuned to the times, the Detours took a dip into the mod culture, donning slick hairdos, sharp suits, and calling themselves the High Numbers. In 1964, the young band was discovered by aspiring filmmakers, Chris Stemp and Kit Lambert, who immediately recognized the potential for greatness.
Kit and I were young filmmakers. This was like 63, 64. The whole thing of music was happening in England, and the idea we came up with was that we would find a group, we would manage them and to success. And that we would film the whole process, you know, the audience, the crowd, how it was done, the manipulation, the media. You know, we were very socially minded, we wanted change and newness, and we were political and we were sort of activists in that sense. So we wanted a group that would fit this. And Kit calls me, he's seen this group, he wanted me to come over. I flew over on the Saturday night, we went to this gig, and it was the High Numbers. They looked absolutely right, and they had this edge, and they were sort of very unique looking and sounding. And John was like, at that point, you know, John was like 16, 17. He looked fabulous, right? I mean, he was the one in the group that had the real essence of sort of what archetypally is the rock and roll star. We just decided that this was, you know, what we were going to do.
In 1965, The Who's single I Can't Explain sealed their first record deal, and thanks to an outlandish performance on the popular TV show Ready, Steady, Go, the band was immediately launched into British rock stardom.
They were appearing to be mod. It didn't really work. You know, the mod look didn't really work for us. And it didn't really work for the group. Concept was called pop art, right? We said, let's go pop art. And we let them go with it.
Our career didn't really change after I Can't Explain. I mean, we had girls trying to rip our clothes, and that was a real nuisance. I hated it. I had little girls shouting through my letterbox because they knew where I lived. But the money stayed at £20 a week, and that wasn't much of a change. And I was still living with my parents.
He never ever said anything like, you know, you and I have known each other since we were children. You know, and now we're in this band, and we're 18 and 19, and we're, you know, there's a chance we might be successful. He never said it, but it was just always there. That was the time when John started to really empower me and was very encouraging to me and nurturing, and used to constantly say to me, no, you're a good musician. This is really where the friendship for John and I began. You know, and I can't say that throughout our career I was able to support him in the way that he had supported me then, but you know, I would just think, well, without him I wouldn't even be here.
So we started to sort of play around with producing, right? And it's all like 4-track, right? 4-track was a big deal in those days. Picture this, you've got like John leading the band, right, on French horn, and Keith holding some sort of snare drum, you know, and Pete on acoustic guitar, and Roger's walking around with some cymbals or something, and they're walking round Pie Studios, kicking, sort of like bafflers for sound, you know what I mean? It was a total sort of mad, improvised, sort of marching band, if you like, with John going, I can't even remember what the song was now, you know what I mean? But it was just wonderful freedoms that we gave ourselves, you know, to develop as recording artists, if you like.
It was a time when new was great, you know, so anything that was experimental and cutting edge, you know, we embraced. It wasn't like, what's that, you know? It was quite the opposite, you know? It was like, wow, what's that?
The actual sort of chemistry of the 6 of us coming together was like perfect in time, and we're all learning. Pete was learning to write, John was learning to sort of like play bass guitar any way he wanted to. Keith was sort of like experimenting with how he played drums, and you know, that change was all there.
The first couple of records were killer. Can't Explain. I mean, just killer song, killer production, right band, right time. But it wasn't until my generation that I woke up to what really The Who was about.
The Who smashed the face of conformity with their revolutionary youth anthem, My Generation, that tapped into the spirit of the 60s and became The Who's immortal trademark. Right with urgency, the song featured vocal stutters, hyper-energetic drum rolls, clanging guitar chords, piercing feedback, and, for the first time in rock and roll history, a solo on the bass guitar.
first heard that bass solo, that blew everybody's mind. I mean, I remember listening with my friend Joe, like, holy cow, that's the bass, unbelievable.
That's when bass guitar kind of opened up. From skiffle, from this dull thud, you know, one to the bar, going through early rock and roll, little riffs, through McCartney melodic, and all of a sudden you had an edge to the bass guitar. And I'd never heard that sound before.
I was in high school, went to a friend's house. He said, "You won't believe this." Took out, I think it's probably a 45 of My Generation. Put it on this crummy little stereo, turned it up, and I was dumbstruck, and I was a fan immediately. It was unashamed, it was unapologetic. This is my generation, God damn it, and here we are.
Arrogant and unabashed, The Who appeared untouchable, but those they let in, they kept close, including soundman Bobby Pridden, who spanned The Who's entire career.
When I think about how it all started, it's extraordinary, really. Their second album was just coming out. That was 1966. And walk in the office, and all of a sudden, Keith and John pull up. They said, "Why don't you come out with us to a club?" So I said, "Sure."
We took him down to a club called the Bag of Nails, and he bought us a drink, so he got the job. It's the last drink he ever bought us, but he got a job, and he's been with us since 1966.
It was quite funny, really. I didn't even have an interview, and that's how my first meeting with John went. And basically, it didn't change that relationship even to the end.
The Who walked, talked, and thought like true rock stars, and they loved to use their wardrobe to shape their image.
The idea of experimenting with clothes was always very much encouraged. So John, of course, loved that, right?
I don't mind other guys dancing with my girl. That's fine, I know them all pretty well.
He always had things made too small for him. I don't know why. Whether he thought they made him look slimmer. They were always skin tight. When he was tiny, he was rationing on, clothes rationing. So he didn't get much chance when he was younger, but he made up for it in later years.
John was a bit of a peacock and a bit of a show-off, as were we all. And only because it worked.
I used to wear three-piece suits. My sort of stage clothes method is that if you're the only member of the band that's standing still, you've got to attract attention somehow. So you dress like a peacock.
John's wardrobe was probably the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen. The colours, the designs. I used to wind him up often and say, "You're not going on stage with that red suit on, are you?"
By 1969, with the release of the full-blown rock opera Tommy, The Who was officially launched into international stardom. The Who's stage shows were extraordinary and their energy unstoppable.
I saw The Who do Tommy live. Whew, what a night, man. What that was, I think it went till 3 o'clock in the morning. It was absolutely amazing, and the power of that piece, Tommy, 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 can you hear me? Oh, God, was it good, man.
The main thing about the Who shows were that we're all solo musicians, and we just went out there and played a solo. The early career, it was a lot more exciting because there were parts of the act where we wouldn't know what we were going to play next.
What I always found is that there was nothing that I could ever play that he couldn't immediately replicate. I've always found that dismaying. And towards the end, I started to think, yeah, he's not as good at it anymore. And then I said to Bobby, tonight, put one of my stacks over his side, you know. And I said to John, just for a laugh, you know, can we do this? And just like the old days. And he said, yeah, okay. And I said, I'll just throw a few things at you at the gig. And I did it. It just immediately You know, I'd go. Couldn't do it the other way round. He'd go, and I kind of go, okay, thank you, conversation over.
I had imbibed a little bit of Dr. Timothy Leary's magic snake oil for the show purposes, you know, to enhance the experience. And it was the first band to use lasers. I'm sitting on John Entwistle's amplifier and they go into Won't Get Fooled Again. I'm like 14 levels beyond reality at this point. The laser beams are going nuts and Daltrey unleashes this animalistic scream. I go right over the back of the amplifier, ass over elbows.
Fighting in the streets when our children on our feet. Tomorrow's the day worship will be gone. And who spurred us on, set judgment on all wrong. They sign and the shotgun sings the song.
John was this tower, you know, and this boom, and these notes and these sounds just coming out of him.
He stood like a rock and played the hell out of the bass. And you saw his intensity. He didn't need to jump around.
We don't get fooled again. Don't get fooled again.
For me, if a rock musician is what playing's all about, is to be able to just get out there and improvise.
Amidst the power chords, charging vocals and frenzied percussion, John Entwistle stood alone. But out of this deceptively calm stance, John produced the sound that defined the loudest band in the world.
Keith was the crazy one. Pete was the intelligent one with the big nose, and Roger was the glamorous singer, and you know, all that was left in there, what can we call the bass player? Oh, he's the quiet one. The other nickname, the Ox, came from, not from how big I was, but more, I had the constitution of one, because I could always seem to eat or drink or do more than the rest of them.
Well, I first met John when I used to dance on Top of the Pops, 68, 69. And I was also working in a club, the Scotch of St James at the time, and he used to come down there regularly. He was quite naughty and mischievous. He used to stir things up quite a lot with people. Although I would never allow him and Keith to come together because they were trouble.
When I got famous, a lot of friends kind of died out there because they were going through their early 20s at the same time as us. They couldn't tolerate the amount of success that I had. A lot of it was jealousy. You know, a lot of people said, well, you don't have to do anything to earn lots of money. And, if they only knew. A typical Thursday, we go in the studio, we try and make another single, and then 4 o'clock arrives and we go to the airport and we get on a plane and we fly to Manchester in a little 4-seater to do Top of the Pops. And then we come part of the way back and we do a concert on the way back to pay for the next day's recording session, right? And the week would go through like that. There'd never actually be a day when you can actually sort of sit down and go, I want to watch telly.
Each member of The Who carried his own intensity on and off stage, but it was the unique prominence of the rhythm section that defined the band as a whole.
The Who, along with Cream, it's another band that comes to mind right away, were great examples of trios who had rhythm sections that went way beyond being rhythm sections. Pete is a massive chord player, you know, and rhythm player and all that, but he's not noodling all over the place. So again, there's naturally a space there, and the traditional role of a bass player is hold the bottom down.
The fact that the Who were only two melodic instruments with drums and a singer, it left a lot of space for me to fill in. I found myself playing bass, rhythm, and lead.
When John first picked up the bass, the instrument held very little history. Without icons or legacy to learn from, John was single-handedly responsible for pushing the bass guitar to the forefront of the rock and roll stage. His impact would reverberate in generations of bass players to come.
He started to change it. I mean, he started to play it differently, hold it differently. The bass players were still aping the upright. They were just kind of going like that. And so you'd see these bass players kind of go, most unattractive position. The most unattractive thing is to see a man going like that. How cool is this? You know, that's all right. Boom, boom, boom. That looks pretty cool, but... So John, you know, dropped it down, started to kind of... And, you know, it's kind of looking at him playing the bass and kind of, this guy looks cool playing the bass. He looks cool. You know, there were no cool-looking bass players. It was a contradiction in terms.
All of a sudden there was Entwistle, and everybody went bass player. So that's what gave, I think, spawned a whole generation of bass players, like you said, Chris Squire and whomever, you know, that just said, oh, the bass player is an integral, important part of the band.
John had his own sound that was slightly different, but he influenced me. That's why I got a Rickenbacker, and that's why I went for that kind of. It's more of a piano sound, really, but everyone hears things differently. But it was trying to emulate the kind of the bass strings of a grand piano, and I think John had the same thoughts.
Now all of a sudden you've got this incredible sound coming out of this bass, you know, and I think that changed rock and roll.
I didn't, at that time, realize how much of a force he was, despite my generation. It wasn't until later, really, then you start listening to the Who's records. And there's a lot of crash and bang and wallop, but there's always this kind of sinewy, very liquid bass line going on. And you realize that there's an intelligence there.
John was doing that particular, you know what I mean, that sort of pluck in the bass. You know, it's difficult to say what it is because it isn't a normal bass line. It's something else.
I don't think you should actually restrict yourself to one style of playing. I mean, sometimes I just play with my thumb and forefinger octaves and stuff. And other times I'll play sideways. I change hand positions a lot of times during songs.
I mean, John's hands were like incredible. I mean, they were so fine, and yet they were sort of like steel. If you ever noticed the way John held a cigarette and the way that he picked up things, he was so delicate and everything was so precise. And yet you shook his hand and he could crush your hand. His hands were so strong.
I think a lot of people don't understand that the Who's sound in the halcyon years was, with John's open harmonic sound, is that what he was doing is he was playing like a Bach organ, rich with harmonics, huge, massive, rich sound, which would start the head going, and you'd hear all these kind of like a psychedelic thing happening.
Everybody thought, well, if I just buy that guitar that he plays, or if I just get that amp, I'm going to get that sound. Well, it doesn't happen that way with John Entwistle. He is the sound.
There's a lot of different sounds you can get out of a bass. Even if you've got one sound set on the amplifier, you can get different textures by changing your hand positions, the force you hit the string with, the way you stroke the string.
The only people who were really aware of John Entwistle, of course, were all the musicians. You know, all the people who understood music, and if not musicians, people who really understood music and knew what rock and roll was all about.
The Who was constantly driven to experiment with new equipment and instruments, and John developed an obsession with technical innovation, bringing his sound to groundbreaking new levels.
He really started to sort of just expand. He was always a sort of very sort of far out bass player.
I knew there was going to be some amazing setup that he had. So when I saw him live, it was unreal. But he was one of the first guys to utilize the alembic stuff And they had a unique thing where they had the bass had two outputs. It went to two different amplifiers, because just like in a home stereo, you have to have a woofer and a tweeter to separate out the high and low frequencies. I think he did a similar thing with his bass, which is brilliant.
He was his own instrument. I mean, it was like a plane taking off when he played, you know.
While Daughtry was the forceful frontman and Townsend the songwriting wizard, it was the synergy between John and Keith that held the very root of The Who together.
With Moon, he played with everybody in the band. You know, sometimes he'd be playing with me, then the guitar solo come along and he'd play drums with the guitar, boring bits in between. He'd play with the singer. You had a lot of freedom. You could play whatever you wanted, as long as when he played a break, as long as you came back in the same time. You know, sometimes you didn't, but it's kind of potluck.
Pete is a great writer, great rhythm player, and very effective, but I never put him in the same league as, you know, Richie or Eric Clapton or someone like that. So to me, he's the brute side of the thing with Roger, and the technical side was John and, believe it or not, Keith.
The two guys created a swirl of rhythm that was like bubbling and boiling. You take that intuition that Keith Moon had and you put that together with John Entwistle and his schooled way of playing the bass a la French horn. Man, you got one of the greatest rhythm sections that ever came down the pike.
The pair's tight musical connection led Keith and John into uncanny improvisation, a freedom they also played with offstage.
They had a very trusting relationship, very loving relationship. Long before Keith was able to tell me he loved me, and possibly, I don't know whether he ever told Roger he loved Roger, I'm sure he did, but he used to constantly talk about how much he loved John.
Keith was like my kid brother. You know, we hung out a lot. We shared the same car. We shared the same room when we couldn't afford separate suites and stuff like that.
They definitely sort of had a common ground with the things that they liked, vices or not, you know, good or bad, but they definitely had some kind of a bond and definitely a very strong relationship.
They were very, 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 very tight, and they were so entertaining. Keith dressed as John before a show. He dressed as him, and he got all his clothes, and he got a black wig like this, exactly the same, and came out and just followed John around in the dressing room. So John would kind of go like that, and Keith would stand beside him and go, and then John would kind of go, and Keith would do it, and then John had this weird thing where he'd do that with his feet, and Keith would do the same thing, and then that thing that John used to do with his nose, he'd kind of go, and Keith would do that, and he was copying everything, and in the end, John just turned to him and went, "Just fucking stop, will you?"
The pair of them used to get up to it all the time. I remember the pranks they used to play on the road. Tear gas being sprayed under your door, and then you run out and there's a trolley being put in front of it, so you collide with the trolley.
In spite of the playful offstage antics and the enormous success of The Who, John was feeling undeveloped as a songwriter. Playing in the shadow of Pete's prominence was no longer enough.
We're going to change it around tonight and play a different song. Instead of Boris, we're going to do My Wife.
The lines of individuality were very strong. So the actual process of writing comes from the very private part. It wasn't that John wasn't a great songwriter, it was that in the time, you know, in the band as the structure was, you know, that Pete had risen to the occasion first, you know. So by the time John's songwriting was equal to Pete's in lots of ways, Pete was the songwriter.
But I still
In search of a stage he could command and a studio he could direct on his own, John was the first member of the band to begin exploring a solo career on the outskirts of The Who.
And what happened was John came to me and he said, look, I am now writing, you know, enough stuff that, you know, I want to do it, I want to record it.
The music on my solo albums is basically, it could have been recorded by The Who. As I say, that the main problem would be that I would want to sing it. And in fact, later on, when that need wasn't so great because I had the solo albums, and I allowed Roger to sing my stuff, I started getting more songs on the albums.
When John came to write his first two songs, Whiskey Man and Boris the Spider, he did them on exactly the same equipment that I was using at home. He bought the same machines and used the same technique and the same mics and everything. But I was the first person that he played Whiskey Man to. He played it to Queenie first, and Alison. And I said to Alison on the way, and I said, what's it like? She said, oh, it's lovely. And then she went, much better than your songs.
Contributing not only his sound, but now his songs to The Who, John wanted the world to hear his music and to hear it loudly.
Being on stage with a guitar, with a big amplifier, with, you know, it became his voice, but not just the voice of his musicianship, the voice of his nature. You know, it was who he was.
In probably the late 70s, it started to grow with gadgets getting in there and a big rack of phasers and God knows what, probably a cigarette lighter if I knew John, and there was in fact. And it just ended up looking like the New York skyline, you know, all these things all lit up, you know, and lights flashing on and off. But he did manage actually to get some quite amazing sounds out of it.
And he never, ever, 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 on any show that I've ever done with John, under any circumstances, has ever been difficult to hear.
This is a song that The Who used to start with. Kind of about festivals. It's called Heaven and Hell. On top of the sky is a place where you know if you've done nothing wrong, if you've done nothing wrong. And down in the ground is a place where you go to get a bad boy. If you think about boy, why can't we have the eternal life? Never die.
One of the reasons why he and Roger never really were able to fully grow into what could have been a really great and nurturing creative friendship was because Roger could not function on stage with this thing called John Entwistle and his stack.
The arguments will always seem to be about the same thing. That usually Roger couldn't hear himself singing. It happened on pretty well every tour, but one tour in particular, I remember that Roger just kept telling me to turn down. Every night he'd tell me to turn down, and I'd turn down, and he'd say, that's better, and I'd turn back up again, and he wouldn't notice. He's kind of like a Chinese water torture, you know, so if he says it at every gig, it kind of wears you down. And at one point at the Houston Astrodome, he shouted at me on stage to turn down. You know, obviously the people in the audience saw it, and I thought, well, this is enough, I can't take it anymore. And I took my bass off and threw it on the ground and said, you play the effing thing. And it's a very expensive bass as well, an Alembic, $3,500 of smashed wood. And I stormed off and walked backstage, and I couldn't find the stairs, so I jumped off the back of the stage, and it was 12 feet off the ground.
But you see, the other thing is that when these arguments happened about volume, and Roger would say, you know, John just has to turn down, I would say, well, In a normal world, yeah, but this isn't a normal world. This is the Who. That's John Entwistle. You know, I think, okay, you know, these relationships become like marriages in a way. There was a strong competitive thing in the band, definitely. But what's interesting about the Who is I think we found, it doesn't look this way, but we found quite a healthy way of dealing with this stuff.
The marriage of the Who seemed to be enough for John. Although married twice, he was ultimately dedicated to his career.
I was always thinking about, you know, music, career, songs, you know, clothes, touring. You know, it all occupied too much of my time to be married. My career took over.
By the time I was born in 1972, Dad was already a fully fledged rock star. His career was, well, the whole career of the Who were going from strength to strength, really. I obviously don't really have that many memories of him at that time, but when I was a little bit older and I was going to school, even still I didn't have that many memories of him because unfortunately he'd be in the studio or he'd be out on tour.
It was my need to keep the career going, and it became a lot more important. And a lot of side problems developed because of that.
Keith and John were, you know, they were the two guys in the band who were absolutely inseparable. After a gig, usually Roger would go home, Pete would usually drift off and, you know, write or something, right? You know, but John and Keith would always go out. You know, there's a lot of energy after a gig, as you know, right? And John and Keith just couldn't sort of just go off. They needed to sort of carry on the gig.
Last of the drunken bands, but we did more booze than anything else. There were a lot of nightclubs with lots of females in that famous rock stars went to, and then they kind of died out because everyone was getting too damn rich to go there every night. So they had their own big country house with their own bar, so they stayed at home, and we could sort of settle down and hide behind our, you know, detached houses in the country. Sex, drugs and rock and roll is only for like young bands that haven't got enough money to buy themselves a big house to hide in.
What was great then is that life was just one great rock and roll party. It was. This is sort of 77, 78, 79. I wasn't doing drugs then, so, you know, it was, I was very naive. I didn't realise how much coke they was doing, as well as drinking. And Keith was doing everything else as well. He'd be doing a lot of coke and drinking, but he'd also be doing, you know, Mandrax to go to sleep. He'd do elephant tranquilizer, anything anybody gave him he would do. I mean, I think John's a little bit more discriminatory. This is what I call the drunken years, you know, where the shows were often shit, to be honest.
Always the most reckless character in the band, Keith Moon would defy anyone who tried to temper his rock and roll lifestyle. But what no one fully realised was that Moon was the energetic crux holding the band together. In 1978, Keith's excessive ways finally caught up with him, and the sound of The Who was forever changed.
The last time I saw Keith alive was at the recording studio. We were putting together a montage of my generation. That's the last time I saw him. I think it was about 2 days before he died.
When Keith died, we were all very distraught, of course, right? But John was like, I think pretty devastated. And he, more than Pete and more than Roger, really had that relationship. You know, it was a soul relationship. You know, Keith and John were together.
Mourning the death of Keith, the remaining members of The Who were faced with an impossible decision.
We all talked it over and we decided that we really should carry on. You know, that Keith wouldn't have wanted us to stop, and that the fans didn't want us to stop. I mean, it's always the easiest thing if you lose a member of a band, to actually stop dead and, you know. But we would have lost so much if we'd stopped.
Zeppelin didn't do it, and I really respected them for that. You know, they said there cannot be a Led Zeppelin without John Bonham, period. End of discussion. Never going to happen. So far it hasn't. The Doors waited 30 years, and now they're the 21st century Doors. And they didn't try to replace Jim or say they were replacing Jim. But it would have been a shame, on the other hand, for Pete Townsend, Roger Daltrey, and John Entwistle not to play together again.
Throughout the years that followed, a string of skilled drummers attempted to fill Keith's shoes, but Keith's unique style and sound proved irreplaceable.
Keith's death affected the music quite a lot. It actually meant that The Who didn't have that crazy driving force, so we could actually start playing songs where, you know, the drummer could use a hi-hat, because Keith never bothered with hi-hat, so they're too quiet. And it calmed the music down an awful lot. And it also meant that I couldn't be as flamboyant on stage as well, which, you know, kind of a little disappointing.
You know what I think it was the most important thing was John lost, when he lost Keith, he lost the ability musically to have a really good time.
1982 was a pivotal year as The Who recorded their last album titled It's Hard, bringing in the noticeably calmer sound of a new rhythm section.
People forget. Spray flies, the speedboat glides. People forget. They forget they're hiding. The girls smile. People forget. Snow packs, ski tracks. People forget. They forget they're hiding behind evidence front. Evidence front, it's a put on. Behind an evidence front. Evidence front, it's a put on. Evidence front. Evidence front, it's a put on.
That was a bit better. It was 11 years that we didn't work, 10 years that we didn't do anything at all together. When we did slowly start to get back together again, we were just celebrating the old music.
Although The Who had intended to disband after their 1982 farewell tour, they engaged in a few more reunion tours and released a series of live albums, harkening back to the hit songs that had claimed their fame.
It was a mistake that we cut so many of the old songs out. It was a mistake not to play more rock and roll. I mean, after all, we were a rock and roll band when we started.
I couldn't work out you know, how to write another Barbara O'Reilly or another My Generation or another Won't Get Fooled Again. I just couldn't think where to start.
As we featured more new songs, it was like pouring water into the Who.
It's not a particularly happy period for Who fans when the Who went out in '89 with a 14-piece band. But I listened to the recordings that we did of Love Rain on Me and I Can See for Miles. And they're great recordings, but John is not wanging away with open harmonics. He's playing the bass. He sounds like Pino Palladino. He's playing boom, boom, boom. You know, he knew what to do. He was a fucking musician.
Up until when Keith was still alive, John started to play, but after Keith died, he sort of started to probably even more so to change and experiment more.
I said to him, why don't you look at me when you're playing your solo number? I can't see you properly. He said, well, I've got to watch Zach on the drums because we take our timing from one another. I said, oh, all right then. Anyway, I sat up in the box, and that day it was at Wembley. And just before he started to do 5:15, he turned around, looked up, he said, I'm going to dedicate this number to my mother. And Pete, Roger and Zach all stood up and all bowed to me. And they put the spotlight on me, and I was so embarrassed. I didn't know where to put myself.
After that, she started to come to all my shows. She came to a couple in Watford.
At this stage, The Who had stopped recording new material, and other than a few farewell tours, the members had minimal involvement with each other. For John, that meant more writing, recording, and touring on his own.
The Who never seemed to play enough. We'd do a 3-week tour of America and then take a year off to write our next project or whatever. And I wait to be out there playing. I mean, the thing that keeps me in this business is playing to an audience. Someone said John Entwistle would play at the opening of an envelope.
But I was very happy to find out that he was really a very down-to-earth guy. For somebody who was such a huge celebrity, he enjoyed being relatively normal. And I remember the first thing I asked him was, did he want to jam?
I met Steve, and he kind of negotiated it that we played together at a jam session, and we played together and we got on well.
I think we both realized that we got along musically, and after that show we wound up sitting around in the VIP room at the Vic telling a bunch of jokes, and we just hit it off.
Best part of having your own band is you can turn up how bloody loud you like.
Instinctively, especially playing with another drummer or another bass player, whether you've got a chemistry or not.
We play really well together, and it's the great thing is it's always different. It's always adventurous. I get a lot more freedom with him. He tends to follow me a lot more, which is a lot easier for me because I can more play what I like.
Just sit on the fence, afraid of the past, so plan for the future. Watching the world go by so fast, just do what suits ya. Nobody told me life up here was an endless vacation. I hope I get old before I die, my generation.
Most of his bravest and most outrageous rig developments were post-Who. We would come back to him and we'd sort of say, do you want to go out on the road? We'd go out on the road and there it would be, you know, the latest Entwistle rig, and we'd hear it and kind of go, well, we'll see what happens. You know.
It's fun for us to play on stage because there's a lot of eye contact. You actually feel like you're playing with 3 other musicians rather than 3 other icons. A lot of bands go on and play exactly the same notes every night, but with my band we don't. We take chances because we enjoy jamming.
It was kind of amazing performing with him, and sometimes I'd be looking out saying, you know, there's my buddy John playing bass, and other times I'd think to myself, it's the bass player in The Who.
If he wasn't performing on a stage or on the road, he wasn't really a happy budgie. He would have done 365 days a year. He lived for playing on stage, and I think that was one of the reasons he liked having a band with Steve Longo, because it was a proper band, and they used to go out and play all these fantastic gigs, small gigs, and he really loved being on that bus. I did that one tour in the 80s with you, and I can remember the pair of us, and he was like a little boy. We had brown bread and tins of sardines, making sardine sandwiches on the bus, and it was probably the happiest I've ever seen him.
Footage from Steve Longo's candid home movies caught on the John Entwistle Band's 1996 tour reveals an intimate and endearing portrait of John, excited to be on the road once more. When not touring with the John Entwistle Band, John enjoyed an eccentric life on his lush and sprawling estate, Quadwood.
I felt, first saw this house about 23 years ago. I already decided on buying a house near Cirencester, which is 20 miles down the road. And the agent that was showing me the property said, well, I'd like to show you this other house, which is 50% more than you want to pay for a house. But I took one look and that was it. It was home.
He lived in a beautiful English manor, whatever it was, 50 rooms, 50 acres, with big, beautiful picture windows overlooking the rolling hills of the Cotswolds in England.
In addition to a recording studio, John had built a little art studio where sketching clever caricatures developed into a second career.
This is what I'm currently working on. The last two Rolling Stones, I left Mick Jagger and Charlie till the end. And I just keep drawing and tracing until I feel it's dead right. You see, I've had trouble with Jagger's eyes. He's got one evil eye and one nice eye. I'm having trouble with the evil one. I've always been interested in art, I suppose, from the age of 3 years old. One of our relatives worked in a paper factory, so my toys for like the first 5 years of my life were drawing on paper. When we did the Who by Numbers cover, it was my turn, and I decided, I might as well just go ahead and draw it myself. I'd rather be drawing horses than rock stars, but usually rock stars, there seems to be a demand for rock stars doing rock stars. I think my favourite was the Keith Moon I did him as Long John Silver. It was the first one I coloured. You have to work out which features can be deformed. Some people you can't change anything. Someone like Rod Stewart, it has to be Rod Stewart's eyes exactly. If you make his nose any bigger, he turns into Ronnie Wood. Art's not as important to me because the music's been my longest love. I'm a much better bass player than I am an artist, so I can't really see myself stopping the art side of me because it's another side of me that I rediscovered. I started collecting cars when the first one broke down. After the Who's first farewell tour, I found myself with a bunch of money and I decided to invest very unwisely in some old American cars. Got a couple of 57 Cadillac convertibles, Eldorados, 64 T-Bird, Rolls-Royce that I had converted into a station wagon for my dogs, but now I've got too many to put in them. I first got interested in armour and weapons when I was a kid. I went to see a film called Ivanhoe, an old MGM movie in the 50s, and suddenly became enchanted by armour. And once I had the money to buy a suit of armour, I bought it. People told me I should invest in antiques, so I invested in the antiques that I liked. I never really counted how many basses in the collection or how many guitars, so I know there's 208 at present, and there has been more and there has been less. I kind of buy and sell a lot, so I occasionally go into my guitar room and surprise myself by opening a case, and I think to myself, oh, I can't remember that one, when did I get that?
During these later years, it became difficult to sustain the extravagant lifestyle John had engaged during the height of The Who's success.
Those years when The Who weren't working, he continued to spend and live the lifestyle of somebody, whereas both Roger and I downsized. He'd made the attempt to downsize, but his idea of downsizing was, well, I'll stay in the country house with 15 cottages. When John bought Quadwood, one of the first things he did was gathered all these people around him, you know, and that's just how he was. I got a sense that he was a bit trapped, and I don't mean that that was by the people. He was trapped by his inability to unravel. He could only kind of go in one direction. He could only acquire, he could only allow in.
The excesses of, I guess I embraced them. It depends whether it's excess in what. You know, a lot of the excesses aren't allowed anymore, or they're too dangerous to do. So, you know, basically the one beginning with S. And the other excesses, I still enjoy drinking and everything else.
The stress of his lifestyle seemed to be catching up with John, and those around him began to take notice.
There was this feeling that, you know, that things weren't quite right. In this very space that we're talking now, he stood right behind where the camera is now and was playing the bass, and then he sat down. And at one point I said to my brother, I think Simon, who was in the band, you know, John's not going to make it, is he? And he said, oh, he'll be all right. I said, no, I know this guy. He's not going to make it. He was ill. He was just physically ill. And you know, you just knew that he wasn't going to talk about it. If you went up to him and you said, are you okay? He'd go, you know, and you wouldn't, pardon? You know, you wouldn't get what was going on because, you know, in a sense, it's not that he internalized it or denied it. It's just, as far as he was concerned, what would happen would happen. Ultimately, John did what people in that situation do. You know, he refused to talk about this with the people that he should have trusted.
Always the quiet one, John kept his troubles to himself. After a lifetime of full exertion, the ox's strength finally gave out.
The rock and roll world mourns the loss this morning of John Entwistle, the bass player for the veteran British rock band The Who.
On June 27, 2002, on the brink of a 3-month tour with The Who, John Entwistle was found dead from a heart attack in his room at the Hard Rock Hotel in Las Vegas.
I said, no. He said, your dad passed away this morning, and my world dropped away, absolutely dropped away.
Oh, that was the most awful night of my life. I knew something was going to happen. I just had a bad feeling when he left. I was thinking of plane crashes. I knew they had lots of planes to catch and that.
I was in my hotel room, and I was in LA in a hotel room, and it kind of wasn't a surprise, really, because what I was saying earlier on about, you know, seeing John here in rehearsal in this very room and just thinking, you know, something, he was kind of grey, and I remember thinking, and it wasn't unusual for a man of his age to be ill. What made it feel to me dangerous is that he was in, as you said, he was in denial about it. He denied that he was ill.
I think the guy went out happy. You know, at that moment, I don't know if he was a happy person, I don't know if he was what, but you know what? He went out like a rock and roller. And for all of you people out there who are like, oh my God, he was, whatever he was doing, you know, screw you. You know, this guy was, he was living the life, and he went out living the life.
Vegas is such an interesting place. It was a natural place for John to go. Do you know what I mean? In that way, he was like, he was going there to get, he definitely went for a reason. We had to go back and play there. We had a contract to play there. And we went back to play there without John, and I went into the bedroom that they had assigned to me as a dressing room, and there were pictures of all my friends on the wall, all dead. You know, Janis Joplin, Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix. I thought, this is a bad joke. You know, they put me in this room with all these dead friends of mine, you know, and I've come here, and I went on the stage and I just ranted, and, you know, and they threatened to sue me because they said that I'd libelled and I apologised. I said, listen, it was just, you know, the whole thing about the hard rock is it's about rock and roll, and, you know, we're all getting old and we're all dying. It's not your fault.
All the other deaths, like Keith's and Jimmy's and all those people, right? We were all still young. This was like real because, you know, John had survived. He wasn't meant to die now. He was meant to die in bed, you know, in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, 20 years' time, like all of us, right?
The main difficulty with the day for me of John's death was that I had to decide what to do. You know, Roger came in shake. I couldn't, I'll do anything, whatever you want to do, you decide, and then went. And I spent the whole night pacing backwards and forwards and trying to summon John up and kind of try and get an answer from him, trying to pray, trying to work out this one, that one, trying to work out what this would be right. And then in the end, I just thought, you know, this is not about John. This is not about me. This is not about Roger. This is about people that have paid, you know, $4,000, you know, maybe a third of their, you know, year's spending money to travel all the way from London to Las Vegas to come to a show which is now not going to happen. It's about the 40 or 50 road crew who are doing 3 weeks with us, and they've turned down 17 weeks with Cheap Trick to come and be on our tour, you know, and they're not going to make any money this summer.
There is something about soldiering on, of course. There is something about the show must go on, of course. And I want to see Pete Townsend and Roger Daltrey heal in any way that they need to do it. But I thought it was disgusting to not even give a second, a moment of grief to a man who you had been through all of those years with and all of that rock and roll history with. I mean, what in the end does that mean if it's just the tour must go on?
I said to Roger, if it was me, I would want you two guys to go home, put away your instruments and never fucking play again. That's what I would want. So I didn't make a profoundly wise decision, I don't think. I think it would have been equally okay if I'd have cancelled it, because I could be sitting here saying, of course we couldn't have gone on without John. But then what we would have had, we'd have no band. You know, there's a bit of me that just wants to kind of grab at this as an excuse to absolve myself of all Who history from now on. And the temptation was huge, and I had to resist it. When I'm gone, when Roger's gone, then John's death actually starts to fall into perspective. What you do have then is you have a band, a history, a bit of a legend, some great concerts, some great records. So what's hard for me is not moments like now. It's those moments like on the stage when I'm taken aback because I look and I expect him to be there. I can tell you with my hand on my heart that when I did look over there and he wasn't there, I wanted to die. I just wanted to die. I realised, you know, I have to fill this air. You know, so I've had to pick up some of the things that John did, and now I'm doing all kinds of flashy little, you know, I'm doing triplet cascades all the time. All over the guitar like some kind of kid, you know, in a guitar store. I'm thinking, this isn't what I do, but I have to fill the air, you know, because there's otherwise these great holes where I go, ja-ja-jang, which is great, but it's a big gap. When's the next one coming? Ja-ja-jang, another big gap. If you have the ja-ja-jang with the because that's what John used to replicate.
John's legacy lives on not only in music and memory, but also through the benefits of the John Entwistle Foundation.
John did so much good work in his life. He did so much for various charitable causes, of course, with The Who, with his solo band, and as an individual that we sort of felt like we wanted to keep that going in his name. So I think part of the foundation is to carry on that spirit and to keep John's willingness to share his good fortune with others, keep that alive.
We still continue to do John Entwistle Foundation concerts, and Steve has kept the whole thing alive and has pretty much kept John as the still the best bass player around, the greatest rock bass player, I think, of all time.
I mean, on a deep level, right? John had as a person, right, a presence and a sort of sensitivity that allowed him to be that big rock star, that allowed him to be that brilliant musician. And that part of him that did all that, from my own subjective viewpoint, you know, knowing him in that period, was that creativity and that sensitivity were like something that, you know, he truly honored in his life.
I still miss that bit. I don't miss the bars anymore, really, but I do miss that thing where I used to come back from a gig and I know for a fact that I could walk in and hear his voice in a bar, holding court with the fans, and I think that was pretty unusual. I think it's wonderful the way he used to sit and talk for hours for them, you know.
After the gig, he always had everybody come into his dressing room, and he was the only one that ever did that. But I used to enjoy those moments when they all came back and he was signing autographs.
He loved his fans. He loved mixing with the people that put him where he was, really. John had a lot of hopes and dreams. You would think that someone who had accomplished as much as he had in his career and his life would pretty much at age 57 be ready to maybe slow down and take it a little easy. But John was always looking for the next project. He loved to stay busy in music. Many times we talked about what we might do when we were too old to go out and play rock and roll.
I saw somebody on the TV the other day playing the guitar, and they barred with that finger and went like that. And I thought, seen that before? John was doing that 20 years ago.
He should be remembered as one of rock and roll's premier musicians.
Taking the bass guitar, that leap forward, if you like, from the old broomstick with a T-chest bass through the early, you know, Fenders and stuff to bang, that rip-roaring, vibrant, emotional sound. And that was quite a journey.
He'll probably be remembered overall as the best damn bass player that ever lived.
His heart was as big as his bass sound, you know.
As my very, very, very good friend in this band, and before that at school, you know, he was such a... I was able to say to his mum the other day, you know, I reserve the right to say bad things about John. You know, I love him so much. I'm so grateful to him. I said earlier on, say it again, I couldn't have done it without him.
The sort of the old sort of, you know, rock and roll guy, that part of me sort of celebrated the way that he died. You know, that John loved to play music. He loved to be on the road. He loved to play in The Who. He loved to play. And he liked the world of that, you know. And that he'd gotten to the fucking Hard Rock Cafe early, because John liked to be on the road early. He loved to be on the road more than anyone else. He liked to show up for rehearsals. He liked to show up to play. He liked to show up to have a good time. You know, John loved to show up for living, and especially the life of a rock and roll star, you know, the life of a musician. John was a musician. He was born a musician with gigantic talent, and he honoured that, you know, and he died that.